Next on our program, we have Yun Sun, a senior associate from the Stimson Center, who will be drilling down into China and Africa relations.
Thank you very much, Chris, for the introduction. And it's my great pleasure to be here today on this panel. I know there are a lot of experts in this room on China-Africa relations, like Professor French, Larry from Rand, and Amadou, my colleague from Brookings Institution. I'm a sinologist, so I would like to share some of my observations in recent developments in Sino-Africa relations from a Chinese analytical point of view. I would like to cover primarily two issues. The first one is the trend in Sino-Africa economic relations. And if there's a time, I will also cover some of the Chinese perceptions and approaches to the Africa security issue. First of all, we all have heard a lot, probably too much, about China's economic miracle or economic success in Africa. That story is faced with some major uncertainties or transformation, to say the least. China has had the lowest economic growth rate in 2015 for almost 3 decades, and that growth rate was 6.9%. And this economic slowdown has had a clear impact over its economic relations with Africa. The total trade between China and Africa in 2015 dropped by 18%, but within that number, Africa's export to China decreased by 40%, while China's export to Africa increased slightly by 3.5%. And this trend has had difficult levels of impact over African countries. In general, this trend has affected resources-rich countries in Africa more. If we use Nigeria as an example, the bilateral trade between China and Nigeria dropped 16% in 2015, but Chinese import from Nigeria has had a much more substantial reduction, as high as 53%. In recent years, China had consistently run a trade deficit with Africa, but last year this trend also changed. It turned into a trade surplus for China. In terms of the foreign direct investment, although we know that the Chinese Ministry of Commerce denied the FT story last year about Chinese FDI in Africa dropping for 84%, it did acknowledge that China's FDI in Africa stood at $1.2 billion during the first 6 months of the year, falling over 40% year to year. The downturn is, of course, in the Chinese statements attributed to the sluggish global economic recovery, the fluctuation of the commodity price, and the Ebola outbreaks in Africa. How we should interpret these numbers is an important question. One caveat in understanding the trade data is that although the value of Sino-Africa trade has dropped significantly, it doesn't mean that China was importing less from Africa in terms of volume. In fact, with the plummeting price of energy resources and large commodities, the sheer volume of China's import in some categories have increased rather than decreased. For example, China's oil imports in 2015, in fact, increased by 9%, and this iron ore import increased by 2% in terms of volume, but not the value. Given China's overall suppressed domestic demand for raw materials due to its own economic slowdown, remains to be seen whether this upward trend in terms of volume is sustainable. The same issue of interpretation also exists in Chinese development financing in Africa. Although the total FDI has dropped significantly, major pledges have been made in Beijing in 2015 to continue its financing to African projects and economic cooperation with Africa. At the FOCAC summit last December, we know that Beijing pledged $60 billion worth of financing to Africa. Most of this financing will not be grants. They will consist of loans, concessional loans, buyer's credits rather than grants or direct investments. The commitment does not have a time frame to it, which is different from the previous FOCAC commitment, consistently had a 3-year framework. Although the Chinese government seems to be working slowly on the actual disbursement of the committed financing, China is unlikely to backpedal from this commitment. The scale and volume of Chinese FDI might become smaller, and they might be less active in traditional extractive industries in Africa. But this does not mean that China will cease being a key player in Africa in the foreseeable future.